in time that the outbreak has taken place? Is there any common source for the epidemic that's going on? So basically just gathering information, assessing risk factors. Once this is done, then we have an analytical study. And an analytical study now looks at the information that was gathered in the descriptive study and tries to identify the risk factors that are actually relevant. And so to look at a cross-sectional study of the population, a range of people, you'll have a retrospective study. Where they'll look at the history, compare actions that were taken, some of the events that might be surrounding the clinical cases. So they'll look at the history of the disease, but they'll also do a prospective study, looking forward. Looking to see if there's anything in the retrospective study that suggests a trend that's developing. If they notice any kind of trends, it might help them thwart the spread of the disease. Identify a population that might be at risk.
That's how they found like the hantavirus linked to mice, where they went back and found that the mice population spiked, and went back and studied the rainfall and stuff, and found that the spikes in the mice population coincided in the Native American population of this disease before?
Sure.
Or is that the same with that retrospective?
Yeah, well, we don't even have to get as abstract as that. We can look at the AIDS virus. Okay. Initially, the descriptive study would have been the cases coming out in 81 and 82 that we were finding. But once they had described the disease, then the analytical part takes over. And they looked at the history of the disease, you know, and that may still be going on, although I think they've pretty much settled on what the history of HIV is. And they also then looked forward, trying to determine populations that would be most at risk. You know, initially, we were probably far off with our guesses with where it came from and where it was going. But as you gather information, you adjust your retrospective and your prospective studies as that information comes in. But yeah, same thing.
Yes, they look at historical things that have the same.
Try to draw correlations, absolutely. And then finally, there'll be experimental studies that take place. Now here we're looking at a cause and effect relationship. Development of new drugs is going on. Trying to assess treatments that are working versus treatments maybe that are not working. You'll see a lot of drug tests take place during the experimental study. This is where we introduce the notion of placebos and double blinds. You know, placebo being a control, so you give one group of people medicine and the other group gets a sugar pill, so they don't get the same medicine. And then you introduce double blinds, the idea that the doctor, if he knows who's getting medicine and who's not getting medicine, just his interaction with them can influence whether or not the individual knows they're taking it. So the doctor doesn't even know who's getting the medicine. What we're finding out, though, is placebos don't necessarily work as well as we think. People, even on placebos, knowing that they're on placebos, just knowing that they're getting medicine, sometimes get better. The psychology behind placebos, double blinds, and experimental results still up in the air, still lots of debate going on. But we're finding that placebos don't always tell us as much as we think they do. So you may read more about that as we go on, or as you go. Last thing I want to talk about today, different agencies that are involved in health surveillance. Surveillance of infectious disease. One that we've talked about several times already this semester, the National Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC. This organization is responsible for monitoring all of the disease across the country. They produce a weekly report called the Morbidity Mortality Report. It identifies all new cases that are been reported, and it also identifies the deaths that have been reported. If you work in the health industry, you probably might be aware of this already. Anytime a new disease is identified, tuberculosis, AIDS, a new individual comes in and they're tested positive for this, that information has to be reported to the CDC, and then it will put that in its report. Some of the other things that the CDC does, they'll conduct research, fund research, especially if you've got a new microbe, new flu virus that hasn't been identified yet, or you're trying to develop vaccines for those. And they provide education, excuse me, for lab personnel. So you have a new disease, a new virus, something that's made its way into the population. You need to educate the laboratory personnel on safety precautions that need to be taken, how to handle the microbe, how to grow the microbe. You know, what are the things that the laboratory personnel need to know? CDC will play a role there. You also have the Public Health Department. That is a more local agency now that's going to control survey the health state of a county, if you will, and not just disease necessarily. They're also going to monitor environmental health as well. So they'll report any findings of infectious disease to the CDC. They examine cultures that physicians will provide, and they also monitor environmental health matters. If you live outside Salinas proper, if you live in a rural area, a community that's on groundwater, that community is probably, I shouldn't say probably, is required to monitor that water for nitrates and for coliform bacteria, and maybe even for arsenic. I'm not sure, depending on where you are. My community up in Prunedale, we have to monitor for coliform bacteria and for nitrates. This information gets submitted to the Public Health Department, and if the values are too high, so right now nitrates can't go above 45 parts per million. If they are, then the water agency or whoever is in charge of maintaining that well has to do something to get those nitrates down. Now, one of the things that they can do is they can blend it with another well that has lower nitrate values, and so the blending drives the value down. Or they can put in some kind of treatment process that removes nitrates from the water. And then, the third agency we can talk about is the World Health Organization. And this organization really is involved in a lot of things. They provide guidance when new disease comes out on, quarantine or on treatment. They'll establish certain standards, laboratory standards. They'll serve to strengthen health programs. They'll fund education. They'll provide vaccines. And they play a role in technology too, funding research and technology, vaccine developments. Any questions, any comments?
Public health course in there too?
What's that?
The U.S. public health course? They're one of our uniform services.
I don't know much about them. I guess they would fall under the CDC.
Well, I don't know, like the uniform service, I don't know, but they go like, they work a lot with the military and stuff. And you know, like nurses and stuff, and they go, I don't know a lot about them, but I know that they do like vaccination clinics and stuff. And they're in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia.
Okay, so it's a military function, not necessarily a